Hi, I'm Pete, and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. I've got a lot of little jobs to do today, cleaning up the shop here and cleaning up some stuff outside. I thought it would be a good time to tell you all about the history of my family on this land. It goes back to 1804. 216 years is a long time. I'm the 7th generation of my family on this place. The more I've looked at my family's history, the more interesting it becomes, even reaching back into those early days. So let's start at the start. My first ancestor to live on this land, his name was Hendrick Miller, and he was born in western Pennsylvania in 1784. He married Catherine Learn in 1802, and shortly after they got married, they traveled from western Pennsylvania to Lansing, which is where we are, to this land. They did it in winter, and it took them 3 weeks. A trip that would take you and I now about 3 hours took them 3 weeks. And they traveled by sleigh, and the reason they did that was because there were no roads. This was the frontier back then. And traveling by sleigh when the ground was frozen was easier than traveling by wagon when there might be mud and other sort of ground issues to deal with. So they traveled when the ground was frozen. They brought with them a heifer calf and building and farming tools. They settled just east of where our farm is now, and they built a log cabin out of the wilderness. It was next to a stream, and so they settled there. Now, Hendrick was an enterprising man, and in the next 20 years, he accumulated 380 acres right around where our farm is. And he built a large house in 1820 near where the cabin was, and that house still stands up the road from us, and a neighboring farm family owns it. At the four corners near our house, he built kind of a little town with a bunch of businesses. He had a distillery, a cider mill, a cabinet shop, and a general store there. Over the course of 16 years, his wife Catherine had 10 kids. Now, one of Hendrick's and Catherine's 10 children was named Frederick, and he was born in 1805, and he was my great-great-great-grandfather. He married Elvira Ingersoll, and they had 5 children. One of Frederick and Elvira's children was named Irving. He married Esther Loomis in 1869. And here we come to the most checkered part of my family history. You see, Esther was a Loomis. Now, if you Google the Loomis gang, you'll find out that they ran the largest crime syndicate in New York, in fact, in the United States in the mid-18th century. They covered the whole state, and they had various operations and centers of power, and it was a huge family. Esther was one of those Loomises. They were horse thieves, they were cattle rustlers, they were burglars. In fact, when they tried to put one of them on trial, the Loomis family came the night before the trial was supposed to happen, burned down the courthouse, and cut the fire hoses that would be used to put out the fire to ensure that the courthouse burned all the way to the ground. Now, Irving was another enterprising miller. He built our house in 1870, and he built all of the big barns and buildings that were here when I was a kid. He had 2 big barns for livestock and hay. There was a blacksmith shop, there was a carriage house, and there were many small barns used for housing livestock, chicken and rabbits. All in all, there were probably 15 to 20 buildings here, plus an orchard, and pretty much everything you needed to be a self-sufficient family back in the day. Now, Irving and Esther only had 1 child. I don't know why they only had 1 child. It may be because they married late. They were nearly 40, and that's why. I have no idea. But that 1 child that they had is probably the most important ancestor that I have in terms of how this farm is today. Her name was Clara, and she was my great-grandmother. She was born on October 3rd, 1880, and I feel like I have this connection to her. I'm not sure what it is. I look kind of like her. Probably if you put me in a dress, I would bear a striking resemblance, although she was always a thin woman. Clara was born here on the farm in 1880, when this farm was brand new. Her parents died in the 1920s. They both lived into their 80s and 90s. Clara would be responsible for carrying this farm from that time, the early 1900s, all the way through to 1970, when she died and my grandfather took over the farm. She went through an amazing amount of change during that period. Farming changed completely. The landscape changed from these self-sufficient small family farms that produced a little bit of everything to farms that went out and grew and borrowed money and bought bigger and bigger machinery. Under her supervision, this farm remained like a time capsule almost. The buildings that her father had built stayed pretty much as they were. The house was never updated. It got minimal electricity, but no plumbing. The barns were kept as they were. The sort of operations that they did were kept as they were. She didn't put a lot of money into maintenance. In fact, almost none as far as I can tell. And researching family history, I found that she wasn't very good at paying her debts. There's several summons to court for paying various people that she owed money, and when we took out our first mortgage on the house, they had to clear an old lien on the property that was so old all the people that had filed it were dead. Right from her youth, Clara was a strong, independent woman in a time when that wasn't always appreciated. When she was quite young, I would say around 20 years old, she worked on the local railroad, and there was a station about a mile down the hill from us. She would walk there, and she sold sundries up and down the aisle as the train was going between Ithaca and Auburn. So she sold cigarettes and candy and that sort of thing. Esther met a Swedish immigrant named Peter Larson with two S's. And Peter Larson, my great-grandfather, is where my name comes from, and he's the reason that the farm transitioned from Miller to Larson, because Clara married Peter. They were married in 1900. They had one child in 1901, my grandfather Dwight, and they separated soon after. The old family story is that Peter came home one day and found Clara sitting on somebody's lap, and you can take that for what it is. I assume there was more to it than sitting on the lap. And that's the last time they were together, even though she wrote him at least one letter, which I have a copy of, asking him to come back. So here was Clara, single mom, one child to raise on this old farm. She did it by selling eggs. She sold canned rabbit meat. But her most famous product, at least as I hear it from older neighbors, was her spring butter. In 1970, my parents, Peter and Jacqueline, decided to move back to the farm, and they carved off a small square and built a house, and that's where I grew up. While I was growing up, I was living next door to my grandfather, and I became really close to my grandfather. I spent a lot of days over here at the farm with him. When I was in third grade, and this was 1977, Grandpa went down to the woods to cut firewood. He had a little business selling firewood, and my mom was in the house working, and my dad was out in his mechanic shop next to the house. And Grandpa didn't come back in the middle of the afternoon as he normally would have. My mom got worried, so she went out and asked my dad to go down and see how Grandpa was doing. Well, my dad went down and found Grandpa dead, sitting on his tractor, slumped over. And what had happened is Grandpa had been cutting a tree at the edge of the woods, and the tree had a large limb that hung out over the field. And as the tree fell, it caught on that limb and thrust the trunk back and hit my grandfather in the pelvis, and it shattered his pelvis. And somehow he made it back up onto the tractor, but he died soon after. And I was devastated. It took me years to recover from that. I carried forward remembering my relationship with him in the way that he was. He certainly wasn't perfect, but I appreciated the time he took with me when I was a kid. Fast forward to 1996, Hillary and I had met and gotten married. We had been living in Syracuse for about 10 years while each of us went to school and had started our work careers. And soon after we married, we decided to move back here to the farm, which was a wreck. The buildings were falling down and it wasn't livable. But we made a commitment, which, thinking back, we were awful young and really, I don't think knew what we were getting into, but I'm glad we did what we did. We moved back and we fixed up the farm. We started with the house. It took us 10 years. And all this time I was traveling back and forth to Syracuse to work as an architect. In 2013, I decided to leave my job. We came back to farming. Hillary was already home taking care of the kids. And we started this farm, which in many ways functions similarly to the way that my ancestors farm. And I'm proud to do that, to carry that tradition forward, to make a living off of 45 acres, as until the beginning of the 20th century, many families did before farms got huge. I hope you enjoyed hearing about our family history. As you can tell, to me, it's alive. It's not just facts and figures on some sheet or in some dusty book. These are real people who live lives on this place, just as Hillary and I and our family are living on this place. And their lives had up and downs, they had scandal, they had success. And it's very interesting to me. The more I learn, the more I want to learn. I hope you enjoyed coming along on this journey with me. And until next time, have a great day.